Shekhar, all to you.
Oh, this is my turn. Okay. Oh, thank you, Rahul. Thanks for making me part of this event. I enjoyed watching your film, Ashish.
Thank you.
Films, I should say. I asked Ashish for the rest of his films. He had given me a couple DVDs of his earlier films, but because I was going to come here, I asked him copies of all other films, so I'm ready. I wanted to ask you something very simple. Let's start with some simple questions about this particular film. Some of the people in the audience have seen the film, the entire film, and some have seen just a clip. But if you could just start explaining a couple of things. First, the title. What is Rati and what is Chakravyuh? Because that will have a great deal of meaning later on. And also, the event takes place, the conversation between 6 couples and the priestess takes place on what you call the lunar eclipse. So what is the significance of the lunar eclipse there? And then let's talk about the circular movement that you have around the couples, what the meaning of the circle is and why circular movement and so on. Okay. I thought I would ask you some simple questions and we can go from there.
Yeah, these are not simple in a certain sense, but yeah. So the first thing, the title Rati Chakravyuh consists of 2 words, Rati and Chakravyuh. Chakravyuh is a term that has a lot of resonance in India, in popular culture in India, especially because of its mention in Mahabharata. So the story goes that Arjun, who's the key heroic character in Mahabharata, many years before the actual battle occurs, is talking to his wife. And his wife at that moment is pregnant with Abhimanyu, his son, who is in her womb. And to entertain his wife, Arjun tells her how to get into this very complex spiral circular battle formation. And so the wife listens to it very carefully. However, because these are not exactly entertaining topics to discuss, his wife actually falls asleep. And that's when Arjun is telling her how to come out of the battle formation. Now, within the fantastical universe that Mahabharata is, Abhimanyu, who is inside his mother's womb, listens to these stories that Arjun is saying. So when Arjun is telling his wife about how to enter the battle formation, he knows that. But when he's telling his wife how to come out, because she falls asleep, the son who's in the womb is also doesn't know how to come out. And during the Mahabharata, I think it's on the 13th day or the 12th day, Mahabharata is an 18-day war, 13th or the 12th day, I'm not exactly sure, Abhimanyu is supposed to attack, and he enters this Chakravyuh formation, this circular formation, knowing that he will not come out, and that is what happens. He enters, and he becomes the youngest of the heroic figure to be martyred in Mahabharata. So that is where the term Chakravyuh comes in, which is basically a one-way path to martyrdom, to suicide, which prefigures in this film. Rati, on the other hand, is a goddess which has had multiple avatars, so as to say. In the Vedic text, in the Vedas, she is the goddess of night. She's the damsel, the goddess, a very mystical and a divine figure. However, in the Puranic text, which is nearly about 1,500 years, 1,000 to 1,500 years later, she becomes the goddess of love, eroticism, and sexuality. And as one story of Rati goes, is that Rati seduces, Rati is making love to her consort Kama, which is the god of sex, and Shiva, who is one of the most important, of the 3 most important figures in Hinduism, actually kills the husband. So there is that story too. So Rati Chakravyuh is conceptually coming from these 2 ideas. The second question about the lunar eclipse is an important moment in certain tantric rituals. So one of the key element of this film, or let's say the conceptual religious subtext of this film, emerges from Tantra. And within the tantric rites, certain rites are performed, certain sexual rites which is related to the worship of the yogini, which is the yogini cult, which is a cult which was very important between the 8th to the 11th, 13th century. And there would be rituals with very obvious sexual acts being conducted where a group of people would come together, couples would come together. So that is the second reference to that's the reference to Luna. Now circularity comes to me in this film mostly as a cinematic act. Because this film, the idea of circular trolley was to create a spiral Chakravyuh-like structure where, so actually throughout the film we did about 57 circles. And so in a certain sense, it's not really, it's a Chakravyuh formation that the audience is pulled into with the eventual end as the death, and therefore the relationships. Okay. Was there any other questions?
No, that's it. Maybe let me raise an interesting thought that I had when I was watching the film. In Indian culture, as far as I know, it's been remote, we've been here for too long, but the notion of circle has a number of different figurative meanings.
Mm-hmm.
There's churning. You're churning things where things are centrifugally kind of mixed together and so on and so forth, which is what you're doing in many ways. You have political issues, religious issues, sexual issues, you have family taboos being broken and so on and so forth. So this circular movement then represents a churning of everything that one can think of, right, in terms of the sort of overall debate. But going back to Mahabharata and other battle formations, I think the notion of circle is important also because that provides you a sort of protected area from which to shoot arrows at things.
Yeah.
And which in a sense you're doing there too. I think there is very potent political critique here, starting from the relationship between Sita and Ravan and so on and so forth, then Gavaskar and his wife, and there's all sorts of things going on throughout the film, which make this film very political. So maybe you could talk about those two things, centrifugal sort of and centripetal forces.
My own biography comes from a before I started working as a filmmaker. I spent nearly about 6 to 7 years as a political activist. Earlier, as a political activist in Calcutta, when I was in school student, and then later on as a college going student in Bombay. My undergraduate degree is in social work, and during those years, this was the early 90s, I was very actively involved with the Narmada Bachao Andolan, which is the anti-dam movement. So I have had, since teenager, a very strong political understanding of my own action in the universe. Although I, at one point of time, discontinued being an active political activist with an organization, I still think of myself as a paramountly a political person. So this film is political in two senses. The very representation is political because within the world of Indian cinema, where at one end you have Bollywood, on the other hand you have realist narrative art cinema, then you have documentary cinema. This kind of cinema, which is deftly what I would call conceptual, is not common. So for me, the very act of the choice of making this film, or let's say my larger body of work, emerges from this act of producing this kind of film, which is outside the market in a very ostensible way, which is outside capital also to an extent, and to make film, although to say to be outside of capital in these times is almost impossible, but at least in a certain symbolic sense, I would want to argue that. So for me, the very act of making the film becomes political. So that is one step. The second step, what I'm trying to do in this film, let's say there are many other forms of obvious political connotations that I'm trying to relate. One is obviously the issue of Sita having sexual intercourse with Ravan. Now that goes back to a very important moment around the time when I was writing this film, was a very important essay by Ramanujam. It's called The 100 Lives of Ramayana, I think. Ramanujan was an Indian folklorist and historian who taught at Chicago in the decades of the 80s and 90s. And he wrote very extensively about Indian religion and about especially its folk impetus. And he wrote this very important essay where he argues that there are multiple forms, multiple kinds of epic text, even though we have a very, and this is around the time when he writes this text, this particular essay around the time when the Ram Jana movement, which is the rise of the Indian right-wing movement, which argues that which argues for a historical temporality of Ramayana and Ram, starts around in the mid-80s. That's in response to that, he writes this essay, says that there are multiple kinds of Ramayana. And this essay I think around the time when I'm writing this, which is early 2009, 2010, is forcibly removed from the Delhi University's syllabus. So this was part of the Delhi University's undergraduate syllabus, and it is forcibly removed by the pressure of the Hindu right-wing groups, which are now part of the Indian central government. And so for me, the attempt was to be in conversation with Ramanujan, and also the idea that we are a country which is being forced to become homogeneous, and especially a religion like Hinduism, which is such an extraordinary diverse, there's nothing called Hinduism in that sense. It's such a diverse religion that the rise of Hindutva parties, the rise of Hindu fundamentalists in the 1980s has, and especially over the last 25 years to the point that we have reached today, there is a very, very strong political attempt at producing a singular narrative of Hinduism and of Ramayana specifically. In the process, other forms of Ramayana are deliberately erased. As a matter of fact, the Hindu right-wing party today is a very North Indian-centric party which is propagating a very specific form of North Indian form of Hinduism. So for instance, in the case of Ramayana, they are very much close to Tulsi Ramayana, which is basically a Ramayana written by Tulsidas around the 15th century, and they are not even, and which is very different to the Valmiki Ramayana, which is a much earlier version. These are two very most popular forms of Ramayana, and whereas in the Valmiki Ramayana is a far more transgressive Ramayana in a certain sense in comparison to Tulsi's Ramayana, which is more conservative and orthodox. And then there are other Ramayans all over South Asia and some in Southeast Asia, which and we know which have a very different way of interpreting the story of Sita and her abduction and her relationship to Ravan. And so for me, that point of invoking in this film this relationship, a transgressive relationship with Sita and Ravan, is in a sense is critiquing the kind of homogeneity of Hinduism that is creeping and has now become the center of the Indian democratic imagination. And then there are other issues, like that was one, and then the other section of rights, which also relates to the rise of the Hindu fundamentalist. And so the rights occur 2-3 times in the film, and they are referring to 2-3 rights. I come from a partition family. I'm actually a Punjabi. Both my parents were born in what's now Pakistan. They came as the early refugee families, and although I never really had a refugee experience, but that form of subjectivity is very much part of my own way of being. And then I was raised in a part of Calcutta which consists of Bengali refugees. So in a certain sense, the idea of rights was very much, was never really part of our growing up imagination, but it was constantly there in the subtext. What happens during the ride, or what happened in the ride, was something that we would hear often. And my personal experience was that in 1992, 1993, I was in Bombay when the Babri Mosque was demolished. And if you know, that Bombay saw the biggest riots of that moment, and I closely experienced that riot, and was then very closely involved as a political worker at that time, working among Muslim and other riot-affected areas. So to an extent, the description that you see, or the fantastical or the surreal description that you see, comes from that particular experience of mine. So for me, even from issue of talking about Maruti as an elephant, as a monkey and a car, all these things are definitely a conscious historical political commentary that I'm trying to make of contemporary late 20th, early 21st century India.
Good, thank you. So let's go back again to the notion of circularity of movement. You said it's a cinematic choice. Was it particularly inspired by any other?
No, before I made this film, I made a film called Kathopanishad, which consisted of also a very long shot. It consists of 3 shots, and there's 1 shot which is nearly 60 minutes long. And my cinema career started when I started making films in the mid-90s. My first body of work consists of single shot films, which I had shot on 16 millimeters, so one could shoot only 10, 11 minutes at a stretch. So for me, the ontology of the single shot has been very distinctively part of my cinematic oeuvre. I'm very interested in this idea of a certain ontological durationality that the single take produces without the cut. So for me, when I was conceptualizing Rati Chakravyuh, it was clear that it had to be a single shot film. As a matter of fact, the idea of a single shot film came much earlier to the content. And so as I was thinking, there were many possibilities. One possibility could have been pretty much like Kathopanishad, which was a Steadicam 1 shot, where you have the camera, the director of photography, the cinematographer, is upholstered with a Steadicam, which allows for a smooth movement of the camera. But I was not sure if I want to do that. So between that idea, I figured out that this circular dolly would allow for this infinite possibility of constant movement, which could be done in a technologically, I would say, inexpensive manner.
Okay, I do want to ask you some other questions in terms of, again, going back to, let me see if there are any other questions by way of explanation or anything that anybody in the audience is seeking. So before we move on to, anybody has any questions?
Maybe I'll.
Yes.
So Ashish, one thing which I was very happy that you mentioned about that there are these political and cultural points you're making, partly these retellings, and there have always been retellings of the epics, and the present government and the party has sort of looked for a more homogeneous, one-ended narrative. But I'm also curious because there are these 2 things to your work which are often one is the more formal aspect, the conceptual aspect on cinema that you're looking at, what cinema could be, what has happened to it. And the other side is your points about what has been happening to India's multiple and more heterogeneous cultures in some sense, right? So how do the 2 relate though in your work? Is this whole cultural storytelling, the retellings that you do here with even the ordinary events of a cricket match, or the retellings of the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. Alongside that, your more conceptual, formal sort of work on cinema itself. Is one an excuse for the other? Is one a filler for the other? How do the 2 work together? I mean, they seem so distinct at times to me. And I know you're preoccupied with both, and you've immersed yourself in both. Your activism work, and in another sense, your sort of deep love for cinema. So how do you...
I think it has a lot to do with my own, again, I mean, I think to answer that question, I'll take a recourse to my biographical moment, is that when I was, my love for cinema and my love for political work started simultaneously in Calcutta. And, Calcutta being, and especially at that time, this is the late 80s, was a very communist city. And in order for you to do any political work, you do political work, but at the same time, you also become culturally active. So you start reading serious literature, you start watching serious cinema, you start reading and writing. And so the culture of becoming political is very intrinsic to the part of becoming cultural. So you become political and cultural at the same time. And so I think for me, when I remember when I was working, when I saw Ray on the large screen for the first time, was around the same day when I was picketing at a rally. So I actually do not see a difference. And for me, at some point of time, I realized that cinema was the most potent form of representational medium for me to engage with India in the way I was trying to do. And then also the fact that then subsequently I got trained as an archaeologist, which gave me an unprecedented opening to ancient India. And then subsequently as a cultural anthropologist, another form of India I was able to engage with. So in the process, what you see is that a culmination of past and present almost seamlessly flows within my own subjectivity. And then cinema was such a seductive medium. And because for me, it allowed me a lot of intuitive possibility that writing or any other medium did not. So I find cinema the best way to think through contemporary India and politically. And with the rise of YouTube and all these other forms, is that it seems like the moving image is unambiguously becoming the most potent form of communicative mechanism. And so I'm very happy to be a part of it rather than write.
Okay, so let's hold on to that and see, get a wider angle, wider zoom out. And it is important what we watch in the age of global cinema or world cinema, as you talked about. It is important what we are watching, but also important where we are watching it from. And not all your viewers are necessarily from India. Your films have been shown around the world, in Shanghai and Berlin and so on and so forth. So I'm assuming that a viewer does not have the background that one needs to pick up to maybe contextualize the film. With that lacking, the viewer is likely to place in the lexicon he or she knows best. So let's experimentally try that. I'm very kind of reluctant to call this experimental cinema, because films like this are now circulating as part of world cinema. They are very much part of world cinema. Slow cinema, I don't think you can call it experimental anymore. It's very much, it's very much a strand of world cinema. So this, to me, is yet another example of slow cinema. I see long takes, which have existed in cinema since 1970s or even before that, but particularly since 1990s. You have something like Tsai Ming Liang or Belatar, they are doing same kind of practice. So they are going to see this film, viewers like that are going to see this film from that perspective. And if they see it from that perspective, I think what happens with the continuous motion is that fairly soon the image separates itself from the narrative and it provokes some other sort of thinking. So if that's the case, then what do you expect? What do you expect the viewers to sort of get from it?
Okay, there are too many things, but let me try. First of all, I'm not really thinking about a viewer at all. So for me, the audience is not important.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not making a film for any audience. I think the only audience that I want to please is myself when I see my own film. So I'm not really, so in that sense, I'm working like an artist rather than a filmmaker. I'm not making a film that has to be circulated within a certain a certain captive idea for the audience. So I really don't have an audience in mind ever, and not for this film, for any of my films. One. So secondly, the way these films have been circulated has a lot to do with the way cinema has evolved in the early 21st century, and the way the film festivals are working, the way galleries and museums, and especially this has a lot to do with the way the cinematic apparatus has transformed from a celluloid-based to a digital-based platform to even much more mobile form, which can circulate very easy. For instance, earlier, at least when I began making films, I had to ship 35 millimeter and 16 millimeter prints. Today, it's just a small hard drive that goes. So I think that the last 20 years has seen a very massive transformation of not just the production possibility of cinema, but also the distribution possibility. Like something like this could not have been possible, let's say 20 years ago, because you need a 16 millimeter projector or 35 projector, and it would have not been possible. So I think that is something very important. Therefore, the film is circulating in various parts. I'm resistant both to be labeled as an experimental filmmaker and a slow cinema filmmaker. Let me talk about slow cinema first. For me, I think of slow cinema as a product of the same global neoliberal cultural polity that has emerged in the last 20 years. And if at one extreme of that polity is the chaos cinema, which has been produced by Hollywood, with this extreme form of cinematic pyrotechnics. And on the other hand, we have slow cinema, which has been cultivated by curators and festival directors in Europe, who have produced this other form of cinema. I won't call it a genre, but another form of cinema, which has its own market. So in one case, in the case of chaos cinema, you have what one could think of it as a multi-billion-dollar market. But in the case of slow cinema, it's definitely a multi-million-dollar market. But both of them occur within a marketplace. One of the key elements of slow cinema is not just, and for me, it is just not the usage of long takes, but it's also a certain hegemony of the visual, where even if you look at Belatar, I mean, I think of Belatar and Simon Lang as more of the cinema of the earlier century, but more later filmmakers, more younger filmmakers, and I'm thinking of Albert Serra, the Spaniard, the Spanish filmmaker, and of his generation. They're more like, and even in India, you have people like Gurvinder Singh, and recently the film Labor of Love. A lot of these films are emerging in India and other parts of. The other example is the Thai filmmaker, Apichatpong. All these filmmakers. I mean, I would kind of separate them, these filmmakers, from the likes of Belatar and Simon Lang, because I think of a slightly earlier generation. But these filmmakers have very carefully understood the way slow cinema work, and I think they have also, in the process, created a visual universe which is hugely hegemonic, which is hugely hegemonically dependent on visual. In the process, orality has been decreased. And what I'm trying to do, and Rati Chakravyuh more so, is a reaction to that form. It definitely uses the one take, but I am infusing it with a certain complex oral universe. So both, which is culturally very deep, and also the very fact in this film there's really a few seconds of silence that you see, which is right at the end of the film. And this is a very deliberated ploy to react to slow cinema. And I agree with you, slow cinema is no longer experimental because it's part of the whole marketplace. I would resist to be called an experimental filmmaker because of what Amrit talks about in his idea of Prayog, because the term experimental and avant-garde comes from art historical genealogy of Western art historical context, and the mimetic conceptual usage of that term in the context of South Asia is both lazy and incorrect. And I think in that sense, I think what Amrit does when he uses the term cinema of Prayog might not be encompassing to what is happening in India within that framework, but I think it is a very important naming gesture. And I personally would take refuge within that conceptual framework rather than these other global transnational conceptual framework as experimental cinema or slow cinema.
Ashish, I think,
Okay.
could you explain a little more the cinema prayoga
Prayog.
for... Yeah.
So, cinema prayog is a term that has been used or has been conceptualized by a film critic, a journalist in Bombay, a guy called Amrit Gangar. And Amrit argues in an influential essay, and which eventually became part of a book, where he says that the term avant-garde or the term experimental is not a very efficient, useful, or conceptually comprehensive of what has been happening in India, which has earlier been labeled as experimental. And he is very specifically talking about filmmakers like Manikal, Kumar Shahani, who made films in the 70s and the 80s. Filmmakers like Kamal Saroop and Amitabh Chakravyuh, who made the films in the late 80s, early 90s. And a few contemporary filmmakers like myself, Amit Datta, he's a filmmaker from Jammu, Vipin Vijay, who's a filmmaker from Kerala, and a couple of other documentary filmmakers. And he kind of argues that these filmmakers are working within the framework, which is very, both epistemologically and ontologically, very different to what the term experimental or the avant-garde signifies. And yeah,
This is all very helpful, but I'm glad that you mentioned the orality aspect in your thing. And I'm thinking, of course, that like all of us in some ways retell the epics almost often in India, right? Like it's a very oral tradition. But the other aspect of orality, because I think you said that you don't care who your audience is, but I think in some ways you care, because finally you're making a political point. I mean, there's a lot of politics happening there, both with the riots, but I think in some ways my question was this, because you're experimenting with orality, prayoging with...
no, not even prayoging, like
yeah.
working, engaging with prayog.
Yeah, working. So the thing is that it seemed to me that, like, especially when you even describe the sort of more, whether it's the violence of the riots or it's the more banal, marital, intimate violence that you talk through, it seems like it's an almost Bergman-esque insistence that it's not so much as the enacting of that violence, but that in its enunciation, in its articulation through talk, or in sort of these conversations, that the violence is most, in some ways, difficult. And that's why your film comes out to be very intense. I mean, some people just can't talk after that. So I'm thinking about, so there's something about this orality in the way that you want to render violence to, or talk about violence, which, so I think there's something political happening.
I think, I'll get back to the audience question. I actually really don't care about the audience in the sense that I don't think of audience something which is outside that needs to be convinced or conveyed. I think of an audience as my own self, as this, I mean, as a post-colonial, trans-global character.
Sure, let's say orality, violence, and its effect.
Okay, so that. Now, coming to the orality question, I think orality is something more, I think within the Indian context, and especially within the Indian Hindu religiosity, orality is more primeval, primordial than visuality. For instance, we know that the earliest imagination of the sacred was oral, not visual. For instance, the earliest iconographic representation of any Hindu religious idol happens nearly 1,000 years after its oral enunciation. So, and we also know that within Hinduism, the orality has the mantric tradition, the tradition of mantras, are far more powerful than the visual tradition. Or let's say they have a more, like the orality is more hegemonic than visuality within the Hindu tradition. The visual emerges only with the rise of, after Buddhism comes in, and we know that Buddhism is the earliest religion which in India that visually depicts both sacred figures, and Hinduism follows it in the early Gupta era, which is around the 2nd to the 4th century AD, that you have the rise of temple architecture happening, but you don't have any archaeological evidence of monumental temple architecture or monumental iconographic program in Hinduism. You do have terracotta being created as early as 2nd century BC among Hinduism, and there is terracotta evidence in Harappa, in the Harappan civilization, but to call it Hinduism would be falling into the trap of the Hindutva. So I will keep that as outside. But you do have evidence. But within Hinduism, the earliest evidence of visually thinking about the sacred only happens around the 2nd to the 4th century AD. So and therefore I think within India, somewhere in its formation, the oral is far more deeper than visual. One way I've been thinking, since we all do film work, if you look at how Hindi film songs circulate more than Hindi films, so for example, songs sung by Lata Mangeshkar, or songs by SD, directed by SD Burman, and all these they still have far more currency within the Indian popular culture than the specific cinematic images. And this is something very, very interesting, I think. For instance, the other thing is that, and this is like Shiv talks about, Shiv Vishwanathan, that the reason cell phone culture really exploded in India is because we were more oral culture rather than a visual culture. So there could be arguments to be made that orality in India is more primordial than visuality. And again, within the understanding of, if you look at the history of Indian visual representation, let's say if you look at the history of two-dimensional representation, which is painting, we have Ajanta around the 4th to the 5th century AD, but the later, and then we have the Indian miniature painting, which comes from Persia. They all lack perspective. They all do not have, when I mean by lack perspective, they lack the Cartesian perspective, which emerges within the Renaissance and the post-Renaissance Enlightenment European modern tradition, which eventually gives birth to photography and subsequently to cinema. So I think cinema, to an extent, in India, comes, the visuality of that specific Cartesian-driven visuality is much later.
That's all fine. I think in some sense it's the more formal, historical, archaeological answer that you're giving me. But I'm asking you more to do also something with orality and violence.
I'm not really sure if I would argue if orality. So what I'm trying to say is that when you describe, I think it becomes more intense than when you see. Especially in our culture in this 21st century, where all you need to do is go to WikiLeaks and you can see the most goriest images ever, right? And if you go on, so somewhere I think there is a certain degree of abstractness and a certain degree of intimacy to hearing about violence than to see it, because it's just everywhere now. It's like, yeah. So I think that's what. But although I'm not, when I was thinking of this film, I was very, I was very sure that I want to visually describe it. I did not even want to visually describe their death, and therefore it comes as a text, rather than, have them picking up guns or jumping from whatever. I did not want to do that. So for me, this was very, very consciously a deeply oral film.
Should we have questions?
Yes, please.
I'm from Canada, and it's a very interesting film because when I was seeing it, I was very Bengali, talking about things that are so hushed up, but are so real. So, talking about marital rape, talking about Victoria Memorial and sex happening, and again talking about your mother in those ways. So, it's not, I think they have actually come out from that mode of violence to be able to talk about it. But it's rather much more violent for us as the audience to think of, okay, what is this happening? But that was my comment, but my question was more like, why, how did you come up with this, with this idea? Because I can understand that keeping the space of Calcutta, you're showing how various temporalities break down and it's the same thing happening in various ways, articulated. But why this North Calcutta house and these married couples?
Okay, so the idea of the film has a very non-Calcutta idea, or probably it has a Calcutta sense to it. The idea emerges, there are three ideas before I started writing. One is the idea of the Last Supper, the Catholic Christian idea of Last Supper, and that comes basically from the fact that I spent nearly 15 years in Catholic institutions in India. I went to a Catholic school, a Catholic college, lived in a Catholic hostel, so I probably know my Bible history than most people in this part of the world. Second was the idea of the mass suicide, and we have mass cult suicide in America, in India, in different parts of the world, and so that was the second idea. The third idea is a very Calcuttan idea, which is the idea of the Adda, which in this case becomes more specific Calcutta. Now this is getting into very, what should I say, a more marital history of weddings in Bengal, is the idea of the Bashor Ghar. The Bashor Ghar is an event that occurs after the night after the wedding. So in other parts of India, the night after the wedding, the couples eventually go into the nuptial chamber. In Bengal, they are not allowed to go to the nuptial chamber, and the whole night, the young couple with their close friends have this, what's the right word, almost a conversation and adda which verges on everything from sexual occurrences, and so it's a conversation where the idea is to not let the nuptial couple, the young couple, go back and consummate their marriage. So you have you talk about all those things that you would do in the bedroom, but you talk about it. So that's something very specific that this film emerges from, the idea of the Bashor Ghar. The middle class, I'm glad that you were able, and the fact that you're from Calcutta, you were able to get the middle class, because I am very consciously talking and thinking about middle class, because I think what has happened with Indian cinema, especially with the art cinema variety and the documentary variety, that there's often the middle class filmmaker takes upon himself to talk about the life of the Dalits, the lower caste, so I don't want to do that. I'm embracing my class identity. I am not at all, I don't have a problem. This is my class identity, and I also I don't think so. I would like to tell their story, because I don't think I have the right, because especially in today's time where there's a lot of Dalit resurgence happening, and I think it's high time that they should talk about their own stories. So I don't want to do that. So in the process, what I end up telling is a very middle class story. And that's a very conscious attempt at doing it.
You've said that orality has some primeval force, but nevertheless, in your film, the speech act is very much stylized, very much theatrical. So I would like to ask you, what's the function of this stylization in relation to the conception of orality as something primeval?
It doesn't probably have a direct relationship to the stylization of acting. Does not have a direct relation to orality, but it does. So let me try explaining you. One of the things that I've seen, again, it's a critique of slow cinema to an extent, but more than that, realism as an idiom in global cinema, and especially in Indian non-Bollywood cinema, non-commercial cinema, since Ray has seen this hegemony of neorealism and realism. And so in India you have most of art house cinema had a very strong realist element to it. The only person, although there is a small strain that defies that realism, that emerges, that starts with Ritik Ghotak, the other great Bengali director of the same time, and his students, namely Manikal, Kumar Shani, John Abraham in South India, and another Kerala-based filmmaker, Arvindan. These are the 4 filmmakers who are very, very consciously trying to create non-realist cinematic idiom. And subsequently, their students, like Kamal Sarup and others, who have also tried to create a different form of non-realistic idiom. So for me, it was very important. And so I trace my genealogy from that form in India, where the idea is to break away from a realist representational idiom. Another problem with the realist representation idiom is what I was talking earlier, is that most of these idea of the realistic representation medium occurs when the middle class filmmaker tries to realistically recreate poverty. When he's basically within the anthropological framework, he's creating the ethnographic other, right? In the case of Ray, we see, I really think of Ray's middle class films as his finest work. His films, even his early films, which people think are better, I have a problem with it, because his middle class film, which happens in the mid-70s, are absolutely stunning because he's actually talking about his own class. And this is also the case with other filmmakers, where they are creating, so for them realism, obviously the genealogy comes from neorealism, that realist representational idiom becomes more useful, more effective to recreate this other India, which is a rural India or a slum-based India, or whatever the case be, which has been the key element of the art house filmmakers. So for me, I'm trying to break away from that. Which again, I'm not, as I said, I'm not the first one. I'm coming from the genealogy, which is constantly trying to break away. So if you look at Manikal's film, Kumar Shani's film, and all these other filmmakers I'm talking about, they're all trying to create this other form. And when you create this other form, the theatricality becomes a space to take a certain form of refuge. And I do that very, very consciously in this film. This film is a theater piece in a certain sense. And this is. And when I was working with the actors, I wanted them to be non-theatrically. So for example, if you see, a theater piece would have a lot more emotion, because the theater demands that kind of emotion. So when they're talking about riots or rape or any of these extraordinary circumstances, the theatrical logic would be that of recreating a certain emotional affect on the actor's body. So I'm totally subduing that. So in the sense, this becomes a film which is both non-theatrical and also non-cinematic realism. And that's what I'm trying to do. In the process, what happens, probably a friction occurs, which makes the narrative move. And associated with the orality is that, as I was telling you earlier, that the language that they speak is also not the language that you hear in day-to-day Bangla. Mm-hmm. It's not a day-to-day Bangla. It is a carefully constructed form of language, which is also non-realist in that sense.
Yeah, I see. And by theatricality, I meant that you're anti-realist and actually not the proper use you make of the speech acting theater. But what was interesting is this insistence on storytelling, but at the same time having this very stylized speech act. So, like, when talking of morality as something primeval, there is a certain understanding of storytelling as grounding our identities and all the narratives we can produce to make sense of this world. And somehow, it seems that you were also working on the voice itself as something meaningful per se. And that's actually what I was.
So you're talking about the voice.
Yes. So how are you actually working on? It's not simply what words mean for telling a story, but it's a certain
Yeah. Let me try answering you. Like, I think there is, again, a very conscious attempt at creating a stoic voice, a stoic enunciation, which is flat. And that is, I mean, which is, when I mean by flat, it is a voice that is devoid of affect. And this is something very consciously done. I think the reason that I'm doing it is because I am, in a certain sense, I would like the voice, and this, okay, and this I'm going to talk a little bit about Indian religiosity, and especially about a tradition in Hinduism, and especially about a tradition which comes from Tantra, and especially about a tradition in Tantra about mantras, where you enunciate certain words which have a divine or sacred connotation within a certain, without any attachment to it. And you would do that constantly. And one of the most common such mantras is the word Om, the monosyllabic Om, and around it there are a number of other words attached to it, other syllables attached to it, which do not really make conceptual semantic sense, but they have sacred connotation. So the way, when I was working with actors, I told them about that the way I would like to enunciate, the way I would like to vocalize the oral has to be within that form of stoic, detached form. I don't know if that answers your question, but yeah, that's where it's coming, yeah.
Any other audience questions? Salia?
The film touched on like such a wide variety of subject matter, and I haven't like taken a lot of classes in film or anything, but I was just curious to know, was there anything specific, like if anything, you wanted people to take away from it once they saw it?
No.
Like, it's just, I don't know, maybe
Nothing specific. I think in a film like this, there's nothing specific that I would like, but I think this is a film about experience. And I think you just carry that experience with you. I think, and kind of, it's an ontological film or a phenomenological film, yeah.
On that note,
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.